Well, good evening. And I'm back, and I am delighted to be back. My friends, tonight we've got a treat in store. I want to read you a story by P.G. Wodehouse. That's Pelham Grenville Wodehouse, author of the Jeeves and Bertie Wooster series that was so deliciously brought to life by Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie. I want to see those again. Now, P.G. Wodehouse, what can I say? I could give you a zillion quotes, but I'm just going to give you one. And this is by Julian Fellowes, who is the author of Gosford Park and the entire Downton Abbey series. He said, P.G. Wodehouse remains the greatest chronicler of a certain kind of Englishness that no one else has ever captured quite so sharply, nor with quite as much wit and affection. And so now one of my favorite stories by P.G. Wodehouse, and this is from a collection entitled Young Men in Spats. And it is entitled, itself is entitled, The Fiery Wooing of Mordred. So, The Fiery Wooing of Mordred by P.G. Wodehouse. The pint of lager breathed heavily through his nose. Silly fathead, he said. Ashtrays in every nook and cranny of the room. Ashtrays staring you in the eye wherever you look. And he has to go and do a fool thing like that. He was alluding to a young gentleman with a vacant fish-like face who, leaving the bar parlour of the Angler's Rest a few moments before, had thrown his cigarette into the waste-paper basket, causing it to burst into a cheerful blaze. Not one of the small company of amateur firefighters but was ruffled. A small bass with a high blood pressure had had to have his collar loosened, and the satin-clad bosom of Miss Postlethwaite, our emotional barmaid, was still heaving. Only Mr. Mulliner seemed disposed to take a tolerant view of what had occurred. In fairness to the lad, he pointed out, sipping his hot scotch and lemon, we must remember that our bar parlour contains no grand piano or priceless old walnut table, which to the younger generation are the normal and natural repositories for lighted cigarette ends. Failing these, he, of course, selected the waste-paper basket. Like Mordred. Like who? Asked the Whiskey and Splash. Whom? Corrected Miss Postlethwaite. The Whiskey and Splash apologized. A nephew of mine, Mordred Mulliner, the poet. Mordred, murmured Miss Postlethwaite pensively. A sweet name. And one, said Mr. Mulliner, that fitted him admirably. For he was a comely, lovable, sensitive youth with large fawn-like eyes, delicately chiseled features, and excellent teeth. I mention these teeth because it was owing to them that the train of events started, which I am about to describe. He bit somebody? Queried Miss Postlethwaite, groping. No, but if he had had no teeth, he would not have gone to the dentist that day. And if he had not gone to the dentist's, he would not have met Annabel. Annabel whom? Who? Corrected Miss Postlethwaite. Oh, shoot, said the Whiskey and Splash. Annabel Sprocket, the only daughter of Sir Murgatroyd and Lady Sprocket of Smattering Hall, Worcestershire. Impractical in many ways, said Mr. Mulliner, Mordred never failed to visit his dentist every 6 months, and on the morning on which my story opens, he had just seated himself in the waiting room and was turning the pages of a 3-month-old copy of the Tatler when the door opened and there entered a girl at the sight of whom, or who, if our friend here prefers it, something seemed to explode on the left side of his chest like a bomb. The Tatler swam before his eyes, and when it solidified again, he realized that love had come to him at last. Most of the Mulliners have fallen in love at first sight, but few with so good an excuse as Mordred. She was a singularly beautiful girl, and for a while it was this beauty of hers that enchained my nephew's attention to the exclusion of all else. It was only after he had sat gulping for some minutes, like a dog with a chicken bone in its throat, that he detected the sadness in her face. He could see now that her eyes, as she listlessly perused her 4-month-old copy of Punch, were heavy with pain. His heart ached for her, and as there is something about the atmosphere of a dentist's waiting room which breaks down the barriers of conventional etiquette, he was emboldened to speak. "Courage," he said. "It may not be so bad after all. He may just fool about with that little mirror thing of his and decide that there's nothing that needs to be done." For the first time she smiled, faintly, but with sufficient breadth to give Mordred another powerful jolt. "I'm not worrying about the dentist," she explained. "My trouble is that I live miles away in the country and only get a chance of coming to London about twice a year for about a couple of hours. I was hoping that I should be able to put in a long spell of window shopping in Bond Street, but now I've got to wait goodness knows how long. I don't suppose I shall have time to do a thing. My train goes at 1:15. All the chivalry in Mordred came to the surface like a leaping trout. "If you would care to take my place?" "Oh, I couldn't. Please, I shall enjoy waiting. It will give me an opportunity of catching up with my reading." "Well, if you really wouldn't mind." Considering that Mordred by this time was in the market to tackle dragons on her behalf, or to climb the highest peak of the Alps to supply her with edelweiss, he was able to assure her that he did not mind. So in she went, flashing at him a shy glance of gratitude, which nearly doubled him up, and he lit a cigarette and fell into a reverie. And presently she came out, and he sprang to his feet, courteously throwing his cigarette into the waste-paper basket. She uttered a cry. Mordred recovered the cigarette. "Silly of me," he said with a deprecating laugh. "I'm always doing that. Absent-minded. I've burned 2 flats already this year." She caught her breath. "Burn them to the ground?" "Well, not to the ground. They were on the top floor." "But you burned them?" "Oh, yes, I burned them." Well, she seemed to muse. "Well, goodbye, Mr. Mulliner, Mordred Mulliner. Goodbye, Mr. Mulliner, and thank you so much." "Not at all, Miss Sprocket. Not at all, Miss Sprocket. A pleasure." She passed from the room, and a few minutes later he was lying back in the dentist's chair, filled with an infinite sadness. This was not due to any activity on the part of the dentist, who had just said with a rueful sigh that there didn't seem to be anything to do this time, but to the fact that his life was now a blank. He loved this beautiful girl, and he would never see her more. It was just another case of ships that pass in the waiting room. Conceive his astonishment, therefore, when, by the afternoon post next day, he received a letter which ran as follows: "Smattering Hall, lower smattering on the whistle, Worcestershire. Dear Mr. Mulliner, my little girl has told me how very kind you were at the dentist today. I cannot tell you how grateful she was. She does so love to walk down Bond Street and breathe on the jewelers' windows, and but for you, she would have had to go another 6 months without her little treat. I suppose you are a very busy man, like everybody in London, but if you can spare the time, it would give my husband and myself so much pleasure if you could run down and stay with us for a few days, a long weekend, or even longer if you can manage it. With best wishes, yours sincerely, Aurelia Sprocket. Mordred read this communication 6 times in a minute and a quarter, and then 17 times rather more slowly, in order to savor any nuance of it that he might have overlooked. He took it that the girl must have got his address from the dentist's secretary on her way out, and he was doubly thrilled. First, by this evidence that one so lovely was as intelligent as she was beautiful, and secondly, because the whole thing seemed to him so frightfully significant. A girl, he meant to say, does not get her mother to invite fellows to her country home for long weekends, or even longer if they can manage it, unless such fellows have made a pretty substantial hit with her. This, he contended, stood to reason. He hastened to the nearest post office, dispatched a telegram to Lady Sprocket, assuring her that he would be with her on the morrow, and returned to his flat to pack his effects. His heart was singing within him. Apart from anything else, the invitation could not have come at a more fortunate moment, for what with musing on his great love while smoking the cigarettes, he had practically gutted his little nest on the previous evening, and while it was still habitable in a sense, there was no gainsaying the fact that all those charred sofas and things struck a rather melancholy note, and he would be glad to get away from it all for a few days. It seemed to Mordred, as he travelled down on the following afternoon, that the wheels of the train, clattering over the metals, were singing Sprocket, not Annabel, of course, for he did not yet know her name. And it was with a whispered Sprocket on his lips that he alighted at the little station of Smattering-cum-Blimpstead in the Vale, which, as his hostess's notepaper had informed him, was where you got off for the hall. And when he perceived that the girl herself had come to meet him in a 2-seater car, the whisper became nearly a shout. For perhaps 3 minutes, as he sat beside her, Mordred remained in this condition of ecstatic bliss. Here he was, he reflected, and here she was. Here, in fact, they both were, together. And he was just about to point out how jolly this was, and if he could work it without seeming to rush things too much, to drop a hint to the effect that he could wish this state of affairs to continue through all eternity, when the girl drew up outside a tobacconist's. "I won't be a minute," she said. "I promised Biffy I would bring him back some cigarettes." A cold hand seemed to lay itself on Mordred's heart. Biffy? Captain Biffing, one of the men at the hall, and Guffy wants some pipe cleaners. Guffy? Jack Guffington. I expect you know his name if you were interested in racing. He was 3rd in last year's Grand National. Is he staying at the hall too? Yes. You have a large house party? Oh, not so very. Let me see. Is Billy Biffing, Jack Guffington, Ted Prosser, Freddie Boot, he's the tennis champion of the county, Tommy Mainprice, and, oh yes, Algy Fripp, the big game hunter, you know. The hand on Mordred's heart, now definitely iced, tightened its grip. With a lover's sanguine optimism, he had supposed that this visit of his was going to be just 3 days of jolly, sylvan solitude with Annabel Sprocket. And now it appeared that the place was unwholesomely packed and crowded with his fellow men. And what fellow men? Big game hunters, tennis champions, chaps who rode in Grand Nationals. Well, he could see them in his mind's eye, lean, wiry, riding breeched and flannel-trousered young Apollos, any one of them capable of cutting out his weight in Clark Gables. A faint hope stirred in him. You have also, of course, with you Mrs. Biffing, Mrs. Guffington, Mrs. Prosser, Mrs. Brute, Mrs. Mainprice, and Mrs. Algernon Phipp. Oh, no, they aren't married. None of them? No. The faint hope coughed quietly and died. Ah, said Mordred. While the girl was in the shop, he remained brooding. The fact that none of these blisters should be married filled him with an austere disapproval. If they had had the least spark of civic sense, he felt, they would have taken on the duties and responsibilities of matrimony years ago. But no. Intent upon their selfish pleasures, they had callously remained bachelors. It was this spirit of laissez-faire, Mordred considered, that was eating like a canker into the soul of England. He was aware of Annabel standing beside him. "Eh?" he said, starting. "I was saying, have you plenty of cigarettes?" "Plenty, thank you." "Good. And of course there will be a box in your room. Men always like to smoke in their bedrooms, don't they?" As a matter of fact, 2 boxes, Turkish and Virginian. Father put them there specially. "Very kind of him," said Mordred mechanically. He relapsed into a moody silence, and they drove off. "It would be agreeable," said Mr. Mulliner, "if, having shown you my nephew so gloomy, so apprehensive, so tortured with dark forebodings at this juncture, I were able to state that the hearty English welcome of Sir Murgatroyd and Lady Sprocket on his arrival at the Hall cheered him up and put new life into him. Nothing, too, would give me greater pleasure than to say that he found, on encountering the dreaded Biffies and Guffies, that they were negligible little runts, with faces incapable of inspiring affection in any good woman. But I must adhere rigidly to the facts. Genial, even effusive, though his host and hostess showed themselves, their cordiality left him cold. And so far from his rivals being weeds, they were one and all models of manly beauty, and the spectacle of their obvious worship of Annabel cut my nephew like a knife. And on top of all this, there was Smattering Hall itself. Smattering Hall destroyed Mordred's last hope. It was one of those vast edifices, so common throughout the countryside of England, whose original founders seem to have budgeted for families of 25 or so and a domestic staff of not less than 100. "Home isn't home," one can picture them saying to themselves, "unless you have plenty of elbow room." And so this huge, majestic pile had come into being. Romantic persons, confronted with it, thought of knights in armor riding forth to the Crusades. More earthy individuals felt that it must cost a packet to keep up. Mordred's reaction on passing through the front door was a sort of sick sensation, a kind of subtle despair. How, he asked himself, even assuming that by some miracle he succeeded in fighting his way to her heart through all these Biffies and Guffies, could he ever dare to take Annabel from a home like this? He had quite satisfactory private means, of course, and would be able, when married, to give up the bachelor flat and spread himself to something on a bigger scale, possibly, if sufficiently bijou, even a desirable residence in the Mayfair district. But after Smattering Hall, would not Annabel feel like a sardine in the largest of London houses? Such were the dark thoughts that raced through Mordred's brain before, during, and after dinner. At 11 o'clock he pleaded fatigue after his journey, and Sir Murgatroyd accompanied him to his room, anxious like a good host to see that everything was comfortable. Very sensible of you to turn in early, he said, in his bluff, genial way. So many young men ruin their health with late hours. Now you, I imagine, will just get into a dressing gown and smoke a cigarette or two and have the light out by 12. You have plenty of cigarettes? I told them to see that you were well supplied. I always think the bedroom smoke is the best one of the day. Nothing to disturb you and all that. If you want to write letters or anything, there's lots of paper. And here is the wastepaper basket, which is always so necessary. Well, good night, my boy. Good night. The door closed, and Mordred, as foreshadowed, got into a dressing gown and lit a cigarette. But though, having done this, he made his way to the writing table, it was not with any idea of getting abreast of his correspondence. It was his purpose to compose a poem to Annabel Sprocket. He had felt it seething within him all the evening, and sleep would be impossible until it was out of his system. Hitherto, I should mention, my nephew's poetry, for he belonged to the modern fearless school, had always been stark and rhymeless, and had dwelt principally with corpses and the smell of cooking cabbage. But now, with the moonlight silvering the balcony outside, he found that his mind had become full of words like love and dove and eyes and summer skies. Blue eyes, wrote Mordred. Sweet lips, wrote Mordred. Oh, eyes like skies of summer blue. Oh, love, oh, dove, oh, lips. With a muttered ejaculation of chagrin, he tore the sheet across and threw it into the wastepaper basket. Blue eyes that burn into my soul, sweet lips that smile my heart away, pum-pum, pum-pum, pum, something whole, goal, and tiddly-iddly-umpty, a, gay, say, happy day. Blue eyes into my soul that burn, sweet lips that smile away my heart. Oh, something, something turn or yearn, and something, something, something part. You burn into my soul, blue eyes. You smile my heart away, sweet lips. Short, long, of summer skies, and something, something, something trips. Hips, chips, pips. He threw the sheet into the wastepaper basket and rose with a stifled oath. The wastepaper basket was nearly full now, and still his poet's sense told him he had not yet achieved perfection. He thought he saw the reason for this. You can't just sit in a chair and expect inspiration to flow. You want to walk about and clutch your hair and snap your fingers. It had been his intention to pace the room, but the moonlight pouring in through the open window called to him. He went out onto the balcony. It was but a short distance to the dim, mysterious lawn. Impulsively, he dropped from the stone balustrade. The effect was magical. Stimulated by the improved conditions, his muse gave quick service, and this time he saw at once that she had rung the bell and delivered the goods. One turn up and down the lawn, and he was reciting as follows to Annabel. Oh, lips that smile, oh, eyes that shine like summer skies or stars above. Your beauty maddens me like wine. Oh, umpty-pumpty-dumpty love. And he was just wondering, for he was a severe critic of his own work, whether that last line couldn't be polished up a bit, when his eye was attracted by something that shone like summer skies or stars above, and, looking more closely, he perceived that his bedroom curtains were on fire. Now, I will not pretend that my nephew Mordred was in every respect that cool-headed man of action, but this happened to be a situation with which use had familiarized him. He knew the procedure. Fire, he shouted. A head appeared in an upstairs window. He recognized it as that of Captain Biffing. "Eh?" said Captain Biffing. "Fire!" "What?" "Fire!" vociferated Mordred. "F for Francis, I for Isabel." "Oh, fire!" said Captain Biffing. "Right-o!" And presently the house began to discharge its occupants. In the proceedings which followed, Mordred, I fear, did not appear to the greatest advantage. This is an age of specialization, and if you take the specialist off his own particular ground, he is at a loss. Mordred's genius, as we have seen, lay in the direction of starting fires. Putting them out called for quite different qualities, and these he did not possess. On the various occasions of holocausts at his series of flats, he had never attempted to play an active part, contenting himself with going downstairs and asking the janitor to step up and see what he could do about it. So now, though under the bright eyes of Annabel Sprocket, he would have given much to be able to dominate the scene, the truth is that the Biffies and Guffies simply played him off the stage. His heart sank as he noted the hideous efficiency of these young men. They called for buckets. They formed a line. Freddie Boot leaped lissomely onto the balcony, and Algy Fripp, mounted on a wheelbarrow, handed up to him the necessary supplies. And after Mordred, trying to do his bit, had tripped up Jack Guffington and upset 2 buckets over Ted Prosser, he was advised in set terms to withdraw into the background and stay there. It was a black 10 minutes for the unfortunate young man. One glance at Sir Murgatroyd's twisted face as he watched the operations was enough to tell him how desperately anxious the fine old man was for the safety of his ancestral home, and how bitter would be his resentment against the person who had endangered it. And the same applied to Lady Sprocket and Annabel. Mordred could see the anxiety in their eyes, and the thought that ere long those eyes must be turned accusingly on him chilled him to the marrow. Presently, Freddie Boot emerged from the bedroom to announce that all was well. "It's out," he said, jumping lightly down. "Anybody know whose room it was?" Mordred felt a sickening qualm, but the splendid Mulliner courage sustained him. He stepped forward, white and tense. "Mine," he said. He became the instant center of attention. The 6 young men looked at him. "Yours? Oh, yours, was it? What happened? How did it start?" "Yes, how did it start?" "Must have started somehow, said Colonel Biffing, who was a clear thinker. "I mean to say, must have, don't you know? What?" Mordred mastered his voice. "I was smoking, and I suppose I threw my cigarette into the wastepaper basket, and as it was full of paper..." "Full of paper? Why was it full of paper?" "I had been writing a poem." There was a stir of bewilderment. "A what?" said Ted Prosser. "Writing a what?" said Jack Guffington. "Writing a poem?" asked Captain Biffing of Tommy Mainprice. "Well, that's how I got the story," said Tommy Mainprice, plainly shaken. "Chap was writing a poem," Freddie Boot informed Algy Fripp. "You mean the chap writes poems?" "That's right, poems. Well, I'm dashed. Well, I'm blowed." Their now unconcealed scorn was hard to bear. Mordred chafed beneath it. The word poem was flitting from lip to lip, and it was only too evident that, had there been an S in the word, those present would have hissed it. Reason told him that these men were mere clods, Philistines, fatheads, who would not recognize the rare and the beautiful if you handed it to them on a skewer. But that did not seem to make it any better. He knew that he should be scorning them, but it is not easy to go about scorning people in a dressing gown, especially if you have no socks on, and the night breeze is cool around the ankles. So, as I say, he chafed. And finally, when he saw the butler bend down with pursed lips to the ear of the cook, who was a little hard of hearing, and after a contemptuous glance in his direction, speak into it, spacing his syllables carefully, something within him seemed to snap. "I regret, Sir Murgatroyd," he said, "that urgent family business compels me to return to London immediately. I shall be obliged to take the first train in the morning." Without another word, he went into the house. In the matter of camping out in devastated areas, my nephew had, of course, become by this time an old hand. It was rarely nowadays that a few ashes and cinders about the place disturbed him. But when he had returned to his bedroom, one look was enough to assure him that nothing practical in the way of sleep was to be achieved here. Apart from the unpleasant, acrid smell of burned poetry, the apartment, thanks to the efforts of Freddie Boot, had been converted into a kind of inland sea. The carpet was awash, and on the bed, only a duck could have made itself at home. And so it came about that some 10 minutes later, Mordred Mulliner lay stretched upon a high-backed couch in the library, endeavoring by means of counting sheep jumping through a gap in a hedge to lull himself into unconsciousness. But sleep refused to come, nor in his heart had he really thought that it would. When the human soul is on the rack, it cannot just curl up and close its eyes and expect to get its 8 hours as if nothing had happened. It was all very well for Mordred to count sheep, but what did it profit him when each sheep in turn assumed the features and lineaments of Annabel Sprocket, and what was more, gave him a reproachful glance as it drew itself together for the spring? Remorse gnawed him. He was tortured by a wild regret for what might have been. He was not saying that with all these Biffies and Guffies in the field, he had ever had more than 100-8 chance of winning that lovely girl, but at least his hat had been in the ring. Now it was definitely out. Dreamy Mordred may have been, romantic, impractical, but he had enough sense to see that the very worst thing you can do when you are trying to make a favorable impression on the adored object is to set fire to her childhood home, every stick and stone of which she has no doubt worshipped since they put her into rompers. He had reached this point in his meditations and was about to send his 232nd sheep at the gap, when with a suddenness that affected him much as an explosion of gelignite would have done, the lights flashed on. For an instant he lay quivering, then, cautiously poking his head around the corner of the couch, he looked to see who his visitors were. It was a little party of 3 that had entered the room. First came Sir Murgatroyd, carrying a tray of sandwiches. He was followed by Lady Sprocket, with a siphon and glasses. The rear was brought up by Annabel, who was bearing a bottle of whiskey and 2 dry ginger ales. So evident was it that they were assembling here for purposes of a family council that, but for one circumstance, Mordred, to whom anything in the nature of eavesdropping was as repugnant as it has always been to all the Mulliners, would have sprung up with a polite "excuse me" and taken his blanket elsewhere. This circumstance was the fact that on lying down, he had kicked his slippers under the couch, well out of reach. The soul of modesty, he could not affront Annabel with the spectacle of his bare toes. So he lay there in silence, and silence, broken only by the swishing of soda water and the whoosh of open ginger ale bottles, reigned in the room beyond. Then Sir Murgatroyd spoke. "Well, that's that," he said bleakly. There was a gurgle as Lady Sprocket drank ginger ale. Then her quiet, well-bred voice broke the pause. "Yes," she said, "it is the end." "The end," agreed Sir Murgatroyd heavily. "No good trying to struggle on against luck like ours. Here we are, and here we have got to stay, mouldering on in this blasted barrack of a place which eats up every penny of my income, when, but for the fussy interference of that gang of officious, ugly nitwits, there would have been nothing left of it but a pile of ashes, with a man from the insurance company standing on it with his fountain pen, writing checks. Curse those imbeciles! Did you see that young Fripp with those buckets?" "I did indeed," sighed Lady Sprocket. "Annabel?" said Sir Murgatroyd sharply. "Yes, father. It has seemed to me lately, watching you with a father's eye, that you have shown signs of being attracted by young Algernon Fripp. Let me tell you that if ever you allow yourself to be ensnared by his insidious wiles, or those of William Biffing, Jack Guffington, Edward Prosser, Thomas Mainprice, or Frederick Boot, you will do so over my dead body. After what occurred tonight, those young men shall never darken my door again. They and their buckets. To think that we could have gone and lived in London, in a nice little flat," said Lady Sprocket, "handy for my club, convenient for the shops, within a stone's throw of the theatres, seeing all our friends." "Had it not been," said Sir Murgatroyd, summing up, "for the pestilential activities of these Guffingtons, these Biffings, these insufferable Fripps, men who ought never to be trusted near a bucket of water when a mortgaged country house has got nicely alight. I did think," proceeded the stricken man, helping himself to a sandwich, "that when Annabel, with a ready intelligence which I cannot overpraise, realized this young Mulliner's splendid gifts and made us ask him down here, the happy ending was in sight. What Smattering Hall has needed for generations has been a man who throws his cigarette ends into waste paper baskets. I was convinced that here at last was the angel of mercy we required." "He did his best, father." "No man could have done more," agreed Sir Murgatroyd cordially. "The way he upset those buckets and kept getting entangled in people's legs. Very shrewd. It thrilled me to see him. I don't know when I've met a young fellow I liked and respected more. And what if he is a poet? Poets are all right. Why, dash it, I'm a poet myself. At the last dinner of the Loyal Sons of Worcestershire, I composed a poem which, let me tell you, was pretty generally admired. I read it out to the boys over the port, and they cheered me to the echo. It was about a young lady of Bewdley who somewhat behaved rather rudely, not before mother, please, father. Oh, perhaps you're right. Well, I'm off to bed. Come along, Aurelia. You coming, Annabel? Not yet, father. I want to stay and think. Do what? Think. Oh, think. Well, all right. But Murgatroyd, said Lady Sprocket, is there no hope? After all, there are plenty of cigarettes in the house, and we can always give Mr. Mulliner another paper basket. No good. You heard him say he was leaving by the first train tomorrow. When I think that we shall never see that splendid young man again. Why, hello, what's this? Crying, Annabel? Oh, Mother! My darling, what is it? A choking sob escaped the girl. "Mother, I love him. Directly I saw him in the dentist's waiting room, something seemed to go all over me, and I knew there could be no other man for me. And now—" "Hi!" cried Mordred, popping up over the side of the couch like a jack-in-the-box. He had listened with growing understanding to the conversation which I have related, but had shrunk from revealing his presence because, as I say, his toes were bare. But this was too much. Toes or no toes, he felt he must be in this. "You love me, Annabel?" he cried. His sudden advent had occasioned, I need scarcely say, a certain reaction in those present. Sir Murgatroyd had leaped like a jumping bean. Lady Sprocket had quivered like a jelly. As for Annabel, her lovely mouth was open to the extent of perhaps 3 inches, and she was staring like one who sees a vision. "You really love me, Annabel?" "Yes, Mordred." "Sir Murgatroyd," said Mordred formally, "I have the honor to ask you for your daughter's hand. I am only a poor poet." "How poor?" asked the other keenly. "I was referring to my art," explained Mordred. "Financially, I am nicely fixed. I could support Annabel in modest comfort." "Then take her, my boy, take her. You will live, of course," the old man winced. "In London." "Yes, and so shall you." Sir Murgatroyd shook his head. No, that dream is ended. It is true that in certain circumstances I had hoped to do so, for the insurance, I may mention, amounts to as much as £100,000. But I am resigned now to spending the rest of my life in this infernal family vault. I see no reprieve." "I understand," said Mordred, nodding. "You mean you have no paraffin in the house?" Sir Murgatroyd stared. "Paraffin?" "If," said Mordred, and his voice was very gentle and winning, "there had been paraffin on the premises, I think it possible that tonight's conflagration, doubtless imperfectly quenched, might have broken out again, this time with more serious results. It is often this way with fires. You pour buckets of water on them and think they are extinguished, but all the time they have been smoldering unnoticed, to break out once more in here, for example." "Or the billiard room," said Lady Sprocket. "And the billiard room," corrected Sir Murgatroyd. "And the billiard room," said Mordred. "And possibly, who knows, in the drawing room, dining room, kitchen, servants' hall, butler's pantry, and the usual domestic offices as well. Still, as you say, you have no paraffin." "My boy," said Sir Murgatroyd in a shaking voice, "what gave you the idea that we have no paraffin? How did you fall into that odd error? We have gallons of paraffin. The cellar is full of it. And Annabel will show you the way to the cellar in case you thought of going there," said Lady Sprocket. "Won't you, dear?" "Of course, Mother. You will like the cellar, Mordred, darling. Most picturesque. Possibly, if you are interested in paraffin, you might also care to take a look at our little store of paper and shavings, too." "My angel," said Mordred tenderly. "You think of everything." He found his slippers, and hand in hand they passed down the stairs. Above them, they could see the head of Sir Murgatroyd as he leaned over the banisters. A box of matches fell at their feet like a father's benediction. And that is The Fiery Wooing of Mordred by P.G. Wodehouse. Oh, my dears, I love it. I hope you've enjoyed it. Well, take care. It's raining, but it's not doing heavy things as they said it might. And I will see you again next Wednesday at 6 for Tales and Cocktails. Thank you very much for joining me. Bye for now.